Fortunately, my talk is only about 20-25 minutes long because I had to compress this thing way down for a talk I did with a Chattanooga organization in the fall. And that was on the competing roles of the press during the Civil War. And I modified a paper that I had written titled General Sibley's Contraband Teamsters and converted that into a live presentation with a few slides. And I guess I'll be pointing to Bob to push the button at this point, which would be new for me to do. But bear with me, this is a scripted thing, but I may make a few comments along the side. The largest group of Civil War soldiers recruited at Minnesota's Fort Snelling, who listed their residence as Fort Snelling, joined the 1st Regiment of Iowa Infantry of African descent. Now, just 4 months earlier, they had fled slavery, had traveled north in crowded barges with their families, and had driven mule teams over 1,000 trackless miles through Indian country to participate in 3 pitched battles. Their sojourn was both celebrated and denigrated by the local St. Paul newspapers. Minnesota's tragic 1862 Dakota conflict mandated quick movement of troops and supplies. Mounted troops able to move quickly to trouble spots were essential to chastise the Dakota and to stop their continuing incursions back into western Minnesota. In 1862, we had 3 companies of Minnesota cavalry. By 1864, we had 30 companies, almost 3,000 men of Minnesota cavalry. The military response required mule-drawn logistical support. 11 by 14-foot Army wagons carried a ton of salt pork, hard crackers, and coffee, enough to feed a regiment of 1,000 men for 1 day. Each Army wagon required an additional 138 pounds of grain and hay every day for a 6-mule team. The military department of the Northwest planned a massive summer 1863 expedition against the Sioux, most of whom had fled into the Dakotas after murdering between 600 and 800 Minnesota civilians. Steamboats delivered brand new supply wagons, ambulances, and harness to St. Paul. Boatloads of young and mostly unbroken Missouri mules soon followed. Mules better endured poor roads, scanty forage, and bad treatment than horses did. At Fort Snelling, these mules were broken to harness and each other. Teamsters rode the left rear or wheel mule to guide each wagon team. Each vehicle needed a teamster. And these, by the way, are Army ambulances upper left, and then a close-up of the African-American teamsters who would be driving those wagons. Each vehicle needed a teamster, but labor was very short after the 1862 Homestead Act, and with former Dakota Indian reservations lands now open for settlement. In mid-April 1863, General Henry Hastings Sibley, in charge up here, telegraphed department headquarters in Milwaukee, "Teamsters cannot be obtained. I cannot spare men from the ranks for the purpose. Would it be possible to procure 260 contrabands in St. Louis to come up with the mules?" St. Louis was then crowded with African-American refugees. Its so-called contraband camp aimed to transition those formerly enslaved into employable citizens to be then transported north. Refugees from seceded states received a certificate of freedom naming their former owner's residence. But those from border state Missouri had to first prove the disloyalty of their individual former owners. Eventually, over 1 million people self-emancipated to Union lines during the Civil War, and about 1/5 of those were eventually employed by the Army. General Grant himself was directly behind the humane efforts to deal with these refugees. Later, federal policy established the United States Freedmen's Bureau to formally take care of these millions of people. Recruiting Teamsters was difficult. Labor was short everywhere. Government advertisements in St. Louis sought Teamsters with competitive wages of $25 per month plus rations. This especially appealed to African American men who could not yet enlist in the Army. It was even more attractive to Army Chaplain Samuel W. Sawyer, Special Agent of Contrabands in charge of the camps in St. Louis. Here was a timely opportunity to aid refugees he would otherwise have to house and feed. The promise of well-paid employment, government-paid transportation up the river, and perhaps eventual integration into a booming Midwest economy fit perfectly with his altruistic mission of settling formerly enslaved people in Iowa, Wisconsin, and even Minnesota. Chaplain Sawyer promptly recruited or selected a group of refugees to dispatch up the Mississippi River, followed shortly after by another, even larger party. On May 5th, 1863, at Fort Snelling, Private John Kingsley Wood reported that, quote, 150 more mules arrived today and about 75 darkies to drive them. These first refugees, calling themselves pilgrims and led by dynamic Reverend Robert Thomas Hickman, and his picture was in the previous slide, assumed legendary status. Purportedly, Hickman secretly constructed a raft on the Missouri River, gathered a contingent of family members and congregation members, and fled slavery by fleeing down the Missouri River at night. Either near Jefferson on the Missouri or on the Mississippi River, the raft was found adrift and was put in tow by a Minnesota-bound steamer. That's the story. And you go to Pilgrim Baptist Church in St. Paul, that's their story. It was reported by the son of Reverend Hickman, who was just an infant at the time, and it really has assumed its own traction at this point. But there are several problems with the traditional story. It's far more plausible that Hickman's pilgrims presented themselves to federal authorities at Jefferson, Missouri, were transported by rail to St. Louis, and there embarked for St. Paul on a barge lashed alongside the steamer Northerner. The Northerner's barge was not a secretly constructed homemade raft of colorful legend. Here's the War Eagle at the landing at Fort Snelling. I knew about this picture for decades, literally, and not until I started working on my book on Fort Snelling and the Civil War did I blow it up and realize that there is a barge lashed to the side of the steamer. The cargo compartment is the raised thing. There's soldiers sitting along that cargo compartment, and they have their muskets stacked and all of their accoutrements piled. So the soldiers would have been sitting on either side of that barge, another crowd on the boat, and possibly even a barge on the other side, also filled with soldiers. The first consignment of 40 Teamsters with 36 other African Americans arrived at St. Paul 5 days later. This barge load of Southern blacks caused alarm at the docks, as editorialized by the Republican-leaning St. Paul Daily Press. Quote, the first installment of Teamsters made their appearance on a barge that was brought up by the Northerner yesterday and consisted of 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. This was rather more than bargained for, and the question arises, what will be done with them? Women and pickaninnies will not render material assistance in driving mule teams over the plains, and they would probably show very large whites of their eyes on such an occasion. We presume they will be left to garrison the fort, while the head of the family goes roaming among the mules. The police were very much alarmed at the appearance of such a thundercloud, and thinking they were landing there, proposed to prevent it on the ground that they were paupers. The Irish on the levee were considerably excited and admitted that they fear he will outstrip them. In other words, cheaper wages. On finding they were bound for the fort, the Irish resumed their whiskey and punches with great equanimity. The St. Paul Pioneer, strongly democratic in its editorial view, presented a more pointed opinion and counted 50 more African Americans in the Daily Press. It brazenly stated, quote, the Northerner brought up a cargo of 125 niggers and 150 mules on government account. It takes back some 800 or 900 Indians, and those were Dakota who had been in the internment camp before the fort and were heading to a reservation on the Missouri River. We doubt very much whether we benefit by the exchange. If we had our choice, we would send both niggers and Indians to Massachusetts and keep the mules here. And just a background story on this, there's been a lot of editorial pushback from Massachusetts abolitionists and other bleeding hearts about the plan to hang 300 plus Indians, and the Minnesotans did not like them stepping in and saying you can't hang the Indians after 600 to 800 white women and children and civilian men had just been murdered. So the Teamsters, African American and also Irish, were immediately put to work at Fort Snelling. And they were out here on the west side of the post. That's the stable yards out there. You'll see the old fort and the round tower down to the right and the junction of the rivers. Just the day after their arrival, one reporter, quote, saw the Teamsters hitch up 24 mules to break, 6 in a team. It was fun alive. The darkies say they are well suited up here. Even Post Commander Major Robert McLaren was amused. He teasingly wrote to his wife, quote, we have great times going out to the contraband camp, and for one who never saw slaves, it is a sight. There are about 300 here now, men, boys, women, and children. Night before last, we made them dance, sing, and etc. What do you think? I'm going to try to get a contraband, and after the war is over, take him home. Okay, a small group of African-American Teamsters were novel amusement to soldiers and little cause for alarm for white civilians, so long as they stayed out at the fort. But back in St. Louis, Chaplain Sawyer had more in mind. According to the Daily Missouri Republican, quote, Reverend Mr. Sawyer came down yesterday from Jefferson City with 3 cars full of contrabands collected at that place and at other points along the road. There were nearly 200 in all, consisting of men, women, and children, the men largely predominating. Many of them were very jolly, singing at the top of their voices John Brown's March and otherwise vociferating. We understand their destination to be St. Paul and that they will be employed as Teamsters in General Pope's expedition to the plains. Mr. Sawyer expects them to be joined tomorrow by as many more gathered up in northern Missouri. The steamer Davenport soon headed north carrying a full load of, quote, 233 contrabands, 150 mules, 64 Teamsters, and a large number of passengers. The St. Paul Daily Press reported the number is actually 218 contrabands, 100 of whom were women and children, plus an additional 65 white Teamsters. Its editor, quote, conversed with several of the contrabands and found them all content and happy. They said they liked to work for Uncle Sam and they were willing to go wherever they could help him. Most of them had been slaves in Missouri, though a few of them were free. The Davenport paused briefly at St. Paul, where again, quote, the low Irish swarmed on the boat as she lay in the levee and endeavored to scare the Negroes with harum-scarum stories of the treatment they were about to receive, cursed them for not staying south, and etc. The Daily Press complimented General Sibley, quote, in availing himself of the excellent quality of brawn and muscle which has been placed at his disposal in the persons of the numerous refugees from slavery who have thronged into the lines of the Union Army. Between 300 and 400 of these contrabands sent upon his requisition from St. Louis have already arrived, and more we believe are coming to serve as Teamsters, cooks, and etc. for the little army of the Northwest, very necessary auxiliaries to the efficiency and comfort of the Army. But Sibley was shocked that many Teamsters brought their families with them. Concerned about his new charges, he asked General Pope, quote, what shall be done with the families of the contrabands sent up? No quarters here for them. Please prevent more from being sent up. The Army soon placed advertisements in the local newspapers to find family members local employment. Quote, a number of persons in our city have been desirous of procuring colored house servants, as it is almost impossible to get respectable white servants now at any price. The quartermaster at Fort Snelling announces that there are 64 women, 70 children, and 30 young men who can be hired by applying at his office. None but persons of known respectability who will treat these unfortunate persons properly can be permitted to employ them. Many of them are experienced house servants and will prove themselves satisfactory to those who employ them. In early June, the Teamsters drove their mules to Camp Pope on the Missouri River, and that actually is just outside the town of North Redwood, if you know where that is, a little tiny place, where General Sibley was marshaling men, wagons, and supplies for his summer expeditions. The Teamsters' continuing efforts to train mules provided amusement to skylarking soldiers. A part of the morning was usually spent watching the Teamsters harness up and attach the unbroken animals to their wagons. while the balance of the day, no matter where or what the duty, was in keeping out of the way of the numerous runaways that would come flying across the prairie, the little mules terrified, the colored drivers hanging to their saddles if they could, while thundering in the rear was the ponderous government wagon, always right side up and never broken. This is actually an illustration from a touring panorama that went around the state in the late 1860s and 1870s, and it's the only contemporary illustration of these contraband teamsters when they are in Minnesota. And while it looks like refugees from a minstrel show, this was what was presented as history to Minnesotans who may not have been aware of this, like I'm sure you were not aware of this episode in our state's history. The immense army of 4,000 Minnesotans required over 200 mule teams to draw supply wagons, ambulances, and pontoon boats. The ponderous column moved slowly west in mid-June, then split in half to allow a mobile force to pursue Dakota Indians fleeing toward the Missouri River. When Indians were spotted near Big Mound, both troops and mule-drawn wagons charged ahead at a gallop. 2 days later, the Dakota attempted to stampede the expedition's grazing animals, but were driven off by troops and the teamsters who armed themselves and fought the Indians. Finally, on the 28th of June at Stony Lake, the warriors delayed Sibley's men long enough for the families to flee across the Missouri River. But most of the Indians' camp equipage and provisions were left behind. The partially successful Sibley expedition slowly retraced its steps and reached Fort Snelling in mid-September. There the teamsters parked their wagons right here, turned their mules into corrals, and soon discovered that their services were no longer needed by the Army. They were far from their Missouri homes, they were out of work, and they were about to experience a Minnesota winter. Stepping into this uncertain future was a persuasive recruiter from Muscatine, Iowa. Sergeant Major Alexander G. Clark took it upon himself to recruit the 1st Regiment of Iowa Infantry of African descent. Many of the former Teamsters were interested, even though the pay at $7 a month was far less than what they had earned driving mules. Not until 1864 would African-American soldiers receive the same $13 monthly pay as their white comrades. The supportive St. Paul Daily Press reported that, quote, Sergeant Clark has succeeded in enlisting some 25 or 30, principally among the contrabands who were connected with the Indian expedition. He will leave with his recruits on Monday or Tuesday for Keokuk, Iowa. Their September 29th departure was noteworthy, but only the Republican newspaper paid a compliment to the 32 new soldiers, quote, recruited principally from among the Teamsters who were brought up early in the season from Missouri and Arkansas. They marched through the streets last evening and made a very good appearance. The new regiment continued to recruit in Iowa as they moved by steamboat to Helena, Arkansas in December 1863. They stayed there until April 1865 to help protect federal-run cotton plantations along the river and to keep the supply lines open. Perhaps some of the former Teamsters encountered men of the 6th Minnesota with whom they had shared the adventures of the Sibley expedition. And this is where the 6th camped, right along the river, a miserable location then and today, if you've ever been to Helena. This was known as Hell in Arkansas because it was so bad, and it still is a miserable place to visit. Like the ill-fated, no reminiscences remain as to whether or not these Teamsters met some of the men of the 6th Minnesota that they had shared a couple of months on the plains with, but it's an intriguing possibility that they did. Like the ill-fated 6th Minnesota, the former Teamsters sickened and died from abysmal, unsanitary conditions at Helena. A quarter of the former Teamsters are buried there today. Guard duty, fatigue service, and patrols were punctuated by only a single hard-fought battle at Wallace's Ferry, Arkansas, in which former Teamster Henry Howard, still a teenager, was killed. My own great-grandfather, Austin Osman, was among those who rode to rescue the surrounded infantrymen on that day and escorted them back to Helena. Other former Sibley expedition Teamsters still living in Minnesota were among the more than 70 additional African Americans who enlisted there in 1864 and 65. Sibley expedition Teamster veterans probably drove wagons in the huge 1864 Northwestern Indian Expedition that culminated in the Battle of Killdeer Mountain. And you remember the painting of Killdeer Mountain was recently removed from the legislative chambers at the Capitol because it was deemed inappropriate. But by that time, those Teamsters had long proven their value, and they were no longer so newsworthy, and so I was not able to find any mention of their participation in the 1864 expedition. African American Teamsters played a vital role in the logistical support of the 1863 Sibley expedition. They amply demonstrated their value to skeptical Minnesotans. They were celebrated by St. Paul's Republican newspaper, vilified by the Democratic press in St. Paul. General Sibley's desperate search for wagon drivers in April 1863 and the expedient federal response in St. Louis brought immigrants to the state that more than doubled Minnesota's African American population. Many of these immigrants shared the hardship of the expedition and they patriotically continued to serve as soldiers for the rest of the Civil War. Others remained here and helped to found the anchor institutions of St. Paul's African American community. Typically in the Rondo area is where those former Teamsters settled. And their stories are part of the ever-changing tapestry of Minnesota formed in the wake of the Dakota expedition of 1863. And I did it with time to spare before lunch, and are there any questions?
Well, I think I was in Redwood Falls a while back, in Redwood Falls, and I think it was Sibley Falls, Sibley River, Sibley Trees, Park, Sibley Park in Redwood Falls. And I think someone is trying to get rid of that. It's Sibley, change the name. Is any name or any place, any statue safe?
No, and even Lincoln's not safe anymore. They're trying to cancel Lincoln wherever they can because he allowed 38 Dakota to be hanged. Never mind that he saved 250 or so from being hanged. His criteria in selecting those who had to face the hangman in Mankato was that they were directly involved in massacre, meaning killing civilians, or they were convicted of rape. There were 2 discovered convicted of rape. The rest were convicted of being involved in massacres. They were hanged. The others had more questionable evidence, including just being present at a battle. And some of them were released. Some were sent to Davenport, to Camp McClellan at Davenport, Iowa, for various terms of imprisonment. They were all released by 1866.
Any other questions for Steve?
Well, again, go ahead.
Steve, are there any documented folks that are direct descendants of these Teamsters still in Minnesota? Is there any work done on that?
Not of the Teamsters. There are Hickman descendants in Minnesota. That is still a prominent name. And my future research on this will be to go to Pilgrim Baptist Church and meet with the staff there and see what they have in their files. I know that the son, Hickman's son, you probably know that in the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, there was an effort to go out and locate former slaves and collect their narrative stories. It's a wonderful project, and many of these are actually taped. You can listen to the voices of formerly enslaved people. But as part of that project in Minnesota, they interviewed one of Hickman's sons. But by the 1930s, we're talking many, many decades after this 1863 event, the story somewhat changed. And so I'm not sure. I suppose if you were to go to St. Louis and really research down there, you might be able to positively pin down, yeah, they took the train from Jefferson over to St. Louis, and yes, Reverend Sawyer got them on the boat, which is what I think happened, as opposed to the story of a boat floating adrift down the Mississippi and being graciously picked up by a Minnesota-bound steamer and towed north. That just doesn't seem likely. I think the steamer would have been paid for every one of the people on the barge, and there probably are records that would verify that. I just haven't searched them out myself. Other questions?
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
And I should mention,